although I did this before the AGM, I think it's very, very important when we get together as Jewish women in Australia that we pay tribute to the Indigenous owners of the land where we are. And one of the things that's quite nice to do is to put in the chat your name and where you are in the country. I'm on the land of the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation in Melbourne. And I've always think it's important that we realize that we are so lucky to be living in this amazing country, but there's a history. There's always a history. Wherever you live, there's a history. But the history of the people who've been in this country who never ceded sovereignty is just so important, because those people are suffering dispossession, suffering disadvantage much disproportionately to the rest of us. And this is a result of the historical mistreatment. We have the benefit of living here. We've got to make sure the land is a just place for everybody. And, you know, the greatest level of racism in this country is directed towards Indigenous people. It's totally amazing. The most amazing people who produce wonderful works of art like this. This is my favorite artist, Ginger Riley. Amazing people. Why there should be racism and discrimination against anyone, I don't really understand. But as Jews, we are very, very familiar with the impositions and problems and difficulties caused by living in a society where you're the victim of racism. So it's our responsibility to move towards a just world. And it's our responsibility to, in Australia, to look out for and be aware of the Indigenous, our Indigenous sisters and our Indigenous brothers, and how we can work together to make this a just world. Tonight, we're going to look at the question of the relationship between misogyny and anti-Semitism and ask, is anti-Semitism a women's issue? And to do that, we're going to start off by asking you to think about the question, what do anti-Semitism and misogyny have in common? And particularly if they're online. Is there anything different about it being online than not being online? But what do you think is the relationship between those things? Our fantastic Zoom master, who you may or may not have met, Danielle is going to put you into breakout groups just for a few minutes, just enough for you to say hello to somebody. So if you've been in lockdown, you actually get some human contact. People in Melbourne know what it's like. We've been in lockdown forever. And say hello, introduce yourself. There'll be about 6 people in a group. You'll have about 6 minutes to talk about who you are and what you see as that relationship. Danielle.
You'll all be whisked away now.
Yep.
Welcome back, everybody. I hope that gave you a chance to have a quick chat and come up with some ideas about what misogyny and anti-Semitism have in common. And now I'll invite Melinda, if I can find her.
I'm actually going to now introduce you to Nikki Malzack. Nikki is going to introduce our speaker. Nikki is one of our newest board members, as in she joined this evening. She became a board member this evening. But she's also an expert on genocide, in the area of genocide, and she's worked with Yazidi women. She's done the most incredible work, and it's a great honor for us to have her on our board. And it's very nice now for her to be able to introduce our speaker, Emily, to you.
Thank you so much, Melinda, and hello everyone, and I'm looking forward to working with all of you over the coming year. So tonight we are joined by Emily Schrader, and Emily is a columnist at the Jerusalem Post, and she's also the founder of Social Light Creative, which is a digital marketing firm specialising in social media marketing. Emily is a regular commentator in the Israeli and international press on issues of anti-Semitism, feminism, and online hate speech, and has run several successful social media campaigns on those issues. She's addressed the Knesset on online anti-Semitism and has also advised the IDF. And Hi, Emily. She'll be speaking to us tonight on why anti-Semitism and online hate is a women's issue. So please welcome Emily Schrader. Thanks, Emily.
Thanks so much. Wow, it's a huge group here. It's exciting to be able to address all of you guys. I'm gonna go through a presentation, and then we can do question and answers and have a little bit more discussion about what I talked about. And also from experience, I found that a lot of people have specific questions about how to do things technically and how to engage in the best way technically. So I want to provide plenty of time if you guys have questions about how you can effectively engage when it comes to battling anti-Semitism, misogyny, or both, sometimes together, online. So I will share my screen. And can you guys see all of this? A thumbs up. I know a lot of you are
Yes,
muted.
we can.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So I'm going to go through a little bit of what we've seen with misogyny online and a little bit of what we've seen with anti-Semitism and the challenges of online anti-Semitism, and then what they have in common, also providing some examples and then some tools that you can use, or at least the methodology for fighting back. So we're discussing today why online anti-Semitism is a women's issue. Obviously, anti-Semitism and women issues have a lot in common. We discussed a little bit about this already in the breakout rooms. But online anti-Semitism is basically a more intense version of everything that we experience in real life. Now, unfortunately, when it comes to the internet, people, because they have a degree of separation between, who they're speaking to, we have seen over and over again, and it's been proven in many, many studies, that this increases how aggressive people are, how nasty they are to each other, because there's not a face behind it, it's a computer screen, or you think. So unfortunately, when it comes to really all forms of hate speech, whether it be, against LGBTQ or women or Jews or other minority groups, we do see an increase in how aggressive it is online. Add on to that being more than one of those things, being a Jew of color, being a Jewish woman, and you see amplified anti-Semitic and misogynistic comments. Here, just in this introduction slide, I've put a few examples. The top one is from coronavirus, when there was a huge increase in anti-Semitism, which I will show you a lot of examples of online, and the type of content that we were seeing about Jews from anti-Semitic accounts, especially in Arabic. And then below is an example of one of the many graphics that was used during the stabbing intifada. I will go over that as well. And then I apologize for the language of this screenshot, but these are the kinds of messages that, this is actually to me, you can see Emily, that I got for the activism that I was doing to support Israel during the last operation. And this is just an example of the type of rhetoric that people give in response to strong women in general, but add on to that strong Jewish women, strong Black women, people who are vocal about their viewpoints online get attacked. Now, I don't say that to deter you or anyone else. I don't think that that's a reason to not engage. In fact, I think the opposite, which I will explain why. But I do want you to understand how significant the situation is, and that it's a genuine problem that we need to deal with. So basically, misogyny over the years as social media has grown has seen a consistent rise in study after study online. And I put here just a few examples of the type of content that we see for public figures. Now, all of the people being spoken about here in these screenshots are elected officials or people who are running for office. And actually, the recent statistics show that women who are running for office in the United States had, and Democratic, not Republican, the study was of Democratic women only, have 10 times more negative comments and harassment than their male counterparts. So that should give you an idea of how prevalent this issue is. The first one is from Canada. Yvonne Okwawa, she's also Asian. She received a tremendous amount of online harassment, online sexual harassment in response to her running for office. Here, of course, we have an example from Donald Trump and how he spoke about Hillary Clinton. Unfortunately, this is something not quite as drastic, but something that we also saw in the media. People like to criticize Donald Trump for his vile comments about women, but the media in general and how they spoke about Hillary Clinton, how they speak and approach female politicians as well is hugely problematic. No, they're not saying things as nasty and aggressive as, you know, individuals like Donald Trump, but they are contributing to it when they consistently speak about how a political candidate dresses, for example, instead of what her policies actually are. And then here you see a comment about Kamala Harris, who is now the vice president, making comments about how they just needed a woman to fill the spot. We do see these type of comments with other minority groups as well, but of course there was more pushback to Kamala Harris's election being vice president than there would have been to a man. And this has been shown in many, many studies as well over the years. Now, this isn't unique to political figures. You would think, oh, well, politics people, you know, they're controversial, they deal with political issues. No, that's not the case. This happens to female journalists. It happens to female activists. It happens basically to anyone who is female that is vocal about their viewpoints, whatever the viewpoints may be. They could be veganism. There is always a misogynistic element when women take a stand on things online. I can't think of a single example when that hasn't been the case, but I'm happy to be corrected if you guys have an example. And then what we see also that's very similar to anti-Semitism, which I will explain, is that we see a transition from the online rhetoric to in-person. That doesn't mean it's the only factor. It means it's a contributing factor. And we've seen this with the anti-Semitism and the rise in anti-Semitism in person across the Western world as well. From the recent operation in Gaza, and also prior to that with coronavirus, we saw a huge increase in anti-Semitic attacks, anti-Semitic graffiti, vandalism, harassment in person, not just online, with coronavirus. And what did we see immediately preceding that? A spike in online anti-Semitism. Now, again, there are many factors that contribute to domestic violence, but we also saw a significant increase in the misogynistic rhetoric online and how people were speaking about women during the coronavirus crisis. Now, part of this, of course, is that more people are online, more people are in lockdown. A lot of people don't have an outlet for things that they might normally have an outlet to, and I don't say that to excuse it. I'm saying that that's the reality. People are locked in. And what we saw, this is just from Israel alone, but around the world, there was a huge increase in domestic violence. Every time there was lockdowns, there were murders, at least in Israel. And there was approximately 800, I think it's more than that now, 800% increase in domestic violence complaints during the lockdown period. And what did we see immediately preceding that? A spike in online misogynistic comments. So it does affect how people view women and where their border is of what they're willing to tolerate. If you're constantly exposed to anti-Semitism online and it's normalized, and you're constantly exposed to misogyny online and that's normalized, then you start to think that it's not such a big deal. And that's part of the problem. We're almost desensitized to it because of how nasty the rhetoric has become online. Now, when it comes to anti-Semitism, since 2008, and also before, but since 2008, pretty much when I started tracking this myself with online anti-Semitism, we've really seen it skyrocket in two ways, in two forms. The first is anti-Semitism that's classic anti-Semitism, and then anti-Semitism manifest as anti-Zionism. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't criticize Israeli policy, of course, and it doesn't mean even that you have to be a Zionist or that you agree with the ideology of Zionism. But how people talk about Zionism today and how people talk about Israel is used for people who hold anti-Semitic views. And that's what we're seeing online. And as you can see, this cartoon was actually published in a UK newspaper, which has classic anti-Semitic tropes in it, but it's depicting the former Prime Minister Netanyahu building a wall with the blood of Palestinians. And then this other screenshot that I placed here is actually from Parler, which is an app that rose to prominence in the alt-right. A lot of neo-Nazis use it because they've been kicked off of other platforms. This app was actually deplatformed from the App Store and from the Google Play Store so that you cannot download it anymore. So it's sort of died out. But I'll talk more about what apps can do and what technology companies can do to combat anti-Semitism. But these are just two examples of the types of anti-Semitism that we see online. And what we also see is that the language between these two forms of anti-Semitism is often very, very similar. So you have classical anti-Semitism from neo-Nazis and from the far right, such as David Duke, who is a leader of the KKK, who wrote a book on Jewish supremacism. And then you see figures like Linda Sarsour, who are considered to be very progressive and leaders of the, I guess, woke movement. She was actually a founder of the Women's March, which is very unfortunate. But then you see her talking about Israel being a Jewish supremacist system. So you see that the language often mirrors each other, even though they're supposedly on different sides. When it comes to Jews, they both hate Jews on the far, far left and the far, far right. Now, what's interesting about the issue with misogyny is that we often see similar language as well in a different way. So when it comes to being a Jewish woman online, you see that a lot of the rhetoric that they used to speak about Jews is then turned and used against Jews as well. And by the way, this is an example from a specific targeted harassment campaign against Luciana Berger, who was an MP in the UK, but this also occurs with women who are not Jewish, as we saw in the recent wave of violence with Israel. People who simply defend Israel also receive this sort of rhetoric. And you see here the classical anti-Semitic tropes, that she is an evil money grabber, among other things, but you also see the rhetoric that they would use against women. And the whole campaign was called Filthy Jew Bitch campaign. It was done by, ultimately it was discovered that it was done by someone who is on the far right. And he spoke about how the number of Jewish MPs is a problem. So here again, we see classical anti-Semitism, and that the way he spoke about her, she has a deep-rooted hatred of men. Back to misogyny. We see the same thing almost across the board, right and left, with female politicians. Almost all leading female politicians have been accused of hating men, especially if they put forth any progressive or pro-women policies or speak about these issues. This is something that we've seen, and not even always from the mainstream, or from the fringe, sometimes even from the mainstream, from different news networks, from different commentators. And again, the main problem with this isn't that one or two individuals think this, it's that it becomes normalized on social media and also in the media when we see more of this. Fortunately, he was prosecuted for this in the end. Now, one of the challenges to dealing with anti-Semitism online is how we define anti-Semitism. So I have a 2-minute clip that I did for a campaign called Adopt IRA, which was pushing the social media platforms to adopt the International Holocaust Remembrance Association working definition of anti-Semitism. And basically what this states is that the Jewish community is a consensus. They put forth with lots of academics and Jewish organizations and bodies around the world how we see anti-Semitism today and how it's manifested, and provided concrete examples of what that looks like. Now, this is unique in that it's not just anti-Semitism, anti-Semitic tropes and the classic anti-Semitism from before. It's also the new anti-Semitism, which is using Zionism as a replacement word for Jews, or Israel as a replacement word for Jews. So we pushed the social media networks to adopt this, not in order to censor anti-Semitic speech, but in order to understand and in order to provide educational resources so that people will have a deeper understanding of what anti-Semitism is and why it's problematic the way that it is. Now, I bring this up in this lecture because it's also important to understand how misogyny manifests today. And I think that social media networks are behind on this as well. Now, as of now, there isn't any sort of consensus definition from women of what misogyny is. But I do think it's something that social media platforms should work on and should look at in how they address different forms of hate speech, because it's hugely beneficial to be able to look at this definition of anti-Semitism and compare it to the content that we're seeing and say, like, okay, yeah, that really is anti-Semitic. There really is a problem with that. It's not coming from a place of genuine criticism, it's anti-Semitic. This is something that is useful as an example, not the same definition, obviously, but as an example for other minority groups as well. So I will just play this. Can you guys hear?
We can't hear it. You'll need to share your sound. If you go to the top under view options, you should be able to share computer sound.
Can you repeat that instruction again, please?
No, so this is just for Emily. If you're playing a video from your computer, you have to share your sound in the same way you share your screen.
Got it.
Bed of hate, in particular
Now we can hear you.
anti-Semitism. In the last month, momentum has been building against social media companies to stop hate for profit. Major companies such as Verizon Wireless, The North Face, and others have pledged to stop advertising on Facebook until they root out various forms of hate against minority groups. But how can Facebook stop anti-Semitism on its platform if they can't even define it? We've seen conspiracy theories, blood libels and tropes, Holocaust denial, and comparisons of the Jewish state with Nazism. These are all defined explicitly as anti-Semitic under the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, a consensus working definition used by over 20 states around the world to identify and fight anti-Semitism. But the current hate speech standards on Facebook, Twitter, and TikTok don't address all these forms of anti-Semitism today. Even when reported, anti-Semitic content doesn't always fall within their broad definitions of hate speech. It's not that anti-Semitism is the only form of online hate. Social media deals with homophobia, racism, sexism, and more. But anti-Semitism today has unique manifestations that have developed from centuries of persecution, such as blood libels, that other minority groups don't face. Just as blackface is deeply offensive to the Black community, blood libels are anti-Semitic. Social media networks should work closely with minority communities to define and combat hate speech against all protected groups. But as Jews, we know that social media networks have totally refused to deal with anti-Semitism for years. In English, and especially in Arabic, the main source of anti-Semitism today stems from social media. It's time for Facebook, Twitter, Google, and TikTok to adopt IHRA into their hate speech definitions. Define it to fight it. Adopt IHRA.
So that's just a little bit about the challenge that we're facing when it comes to defining anti-Semitism online. And I'm just going to go over a few of the spikes that we've seen in anti-Semitism and how it's written in connection with world events. This, of course, doesn't include everything, but just the patterns that I have been tracking in the research that I've done and the work that I've worked on. So obviously in 2008 with Operation Cast Lead, social media wasn't nearly as active as it is today. But in 2012, we saw a huge increase, and for the first time, we saw actual social media efforts by official actors. So we saw Hamas being very active on social media for the first time. Ultimately, they were kicked off, but they were tweeting every time they were firing rockets at Israeli civilians. Then in 2014, we saw an even greater increase with the operation that happened there. And then from 2015 to 2016, something interesting happened on social media when it comes to anti-Semitism. There was a huge wave in Israel of stabbing attacks and car ramming attacks from Palestinians. And what we were seeing online in Arabic was a campaign called the Knife Intifada, in Arabic, of course, but Knife Intifada, with a hashtag and everything, in which Palestinians were sharing information on how to stab Jews and how to attack Jews. They were praising each other. They were encouraging people, in particular young people, teenagers, to go out and carry out attacks against Israel, even if it was soldiers or policemen. The point was that they were going to liberate Al-Aqsa by stabbing Jews. And by the way, in Arabic, there was no distinction between Jews or Israelis. It was Jews, all Jews. And you can see it in a lot of the caricatures and content that they put out. And what we saw from that is that social media has a direct link to real world violence, and it has a direct role to play in encouraging that cycle of violence that occurs. And we saw immediately preceding that social media networks did not remove the content repeatedly. In fact, I think there's actually a class action lawsuit from Shurat Hadin about it that may still be going on. About how this content was reported, and it consistently didn't violate community standards. So this was the first time that we really saw pushback in Israel against social media platforms for not removing the content. Since then, Facebook, not the other platforms, but Facebook has been much more vigilant about removing explicit calls to violence. but they haven't been as good about removing anti-Semitic content and the type of language that leads to the same results, which is why we're seeing what we're seeing. So again, we've made progress, but we're not quite where we need to be. We also saw with the United States, in particular, the rise of movements like Black Lives Matter, also the Women's March, and how they tied that into anti-Zionism and anti-Israel activity. And unfortunately, what we saw is that this isn't about Israeli policy. It's really about the existence of a Jewish state. It's about the right of Jewish people to self-determination. And they have intentionally, because of people like Linda Sarsour, placed Jewish people in the category of white, even though Jews aren't really white, even if white passing, and have been persecuted for centuries because of it. So there has been a concerted effort to push Jews out of this discussion of minority communities, even though they're the most oppressed minority in the history of mankind. And unfortunately, they've been very effective in that. And that has also contributed to anti-Semitism and a lack of understanding about what anti-Semitism is on the far left, including on women's issues and in women's rights organizations. Many of the women's rights organizations lean anti-Israel because of this sort of rhetoric. And really what's at the root of it, for most people who are not involved in this conflict, is an ignorance about what anti-Semitism is and how it manifests, and an ignorance about Jewish history, who the Jewish people are, and why the concept of Zionism, which is non-exclusive, is important to the Jewish people. Really, it should be that Zionism is a progressive movement, because all Zionism means is that it is the right of the Jewish people, the same as any other people, to self-determination in their homeland. And this is something that people just don't understand, and it's because the anti-Israel movements, many of them with anti-Semitic elements, have been very effective in pushing that forward. We also saw a huge increase in anti-Semitic rhetoric from the alt-right over the last few years. And then in 2020, with the coronavirus crisis, we saw a massive increase of anti-Semitism online, which ultimately led to in-person anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic attacks. And then with the operation this year in Gaza, we again saw violence against Jewish communities, both inside and outside of Israel. And these are a few examples of the type of content that we saw during the last operation. So Veena Malik is a movie star, I think from Pakistan. But she has 2 million followers, I think some in the millions on Instagram as well. This is from her Twitter. She was tweeting throughout the operation, you know, free Palestine, we support the people of Gaza, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, fine. And she doesn't support Israel in this conflict, fine. But then immediately below, you see a quote or purported quote from Adolf Hitler. So again, we see that this is beyond criticism of Israel. It's beyond support for Palestinians. It's anti-Semitism. And because the networks haven't defined, using IRA or anything else really, they haven't defined what anti-Semitism actually is today, their terms of speech and how they remove this content doesn't always remove content like this, or not even remove, but place a warning like they do when you see violent content on social media. It places an automatic warning. So they can do that. They can automatically know what is violent content, but they can't automatically flag content that's anti-Semitic. It doesn't make any sense. And then below we have a tweet from Tala Halawa, who was a journalist for BBC until this tweet was exposed. And she was tweeting about how Hitler was right. Again, not criticism of Israel. This is anti-Semitism. And this is from a journalist, a mainstream journalist. And what's especially disturbing about the last operation is that this hashtag Hitler was right was actually trending at one point on Twitter. And how Twitter would allow something like that to be displayed as a trend is beyond my understanding. They do have the ability to control things like this, and consistently they don't. Things like this continue to happen. Again, there have been improvements, but really this is just unacceptable, completely unacceptable. A few examples from the COVID campaign that we saw. The COVID 48 campaign was actually started by BDS activists in Jordan. It was most prevalent in Arabic, although it also expanded to other communities, English-speaking communities, and actually the alt-right. Like I said, sometimes that language echoes each other. The hashtag was COVID 48 because that's when the state of Israel was established. Important to note that this is 48, not 67. So there was no occupation that many talk about when it comes to Israel. The problem here is the existence of Israel, period. So we saw graphics like this, that the Jews are the actual virus, and that a lot of conspiracies that the Jews created coronavirus in order to develop the vaccine for money, all kinds of things. These were going crazy on social media with thousands and thousands of retweets. And then a few examples from the stabbing intifada, which I mentioned. This is content, at least the top left post with the like button with the knife. This was actually something I myself reported, and Facebook responded to me and said that it didn't violate their community standards. The image below of from the knife intifada as well, you can see that there's a reflection of an Orthodox Jew in the knife itself, in the graphic. And the other one is also from the knife intifada, and it says the knife intifada or stabbing intifada, and that we're coming to slaughter you. That's what it says in Hebrew. All of these were shared widely across Palestinian social media. And, you know, after weeks after, Facebook would remove them after the damage was already done. And then a few examples of the type of content that we've seen from movements who purport to be progressive. So the top left is an image that was posted on, a flyer that was posted on a campus in the United States that was supposed to be against Islamophobia. When it was investigated, it turns out that Black Lives Matter, or the chapter of Black Lives Matter that was local there, actually was behind this image. And again, like I said, it's sort of putting Jews in the category of white people who are oppressing others. They frame everything in the narrative of the oppressed or the oppressor. Now, the irony of this is that if you're going to frame things that way, then the Jews should be in the category of people who are oppressed, obviously. But somehow they sort of have twisted this successfully, unfortunately, into making Jews somehow the oppressor. And the example that they use of this is Israel, that Israel is oppressing the poor Palestinians and the Palestinians are indigenous, despite the fact that that's not true. Again, Black Lives Matter in the UK had similar rhetoric during the last operation, criticizing Zionism and Israel, even though that doesn't really have anything to do with the conflict that was occurring in May. And then the video, which I'm not going to share because it's actually a little bit long, and I want to make sure that we get through everything, is a Holocaust survivor who is not Israeli, has never lived in Israel, and does not speak Hebrew, who spoke on a campus, I believe in Canada, and the Students for Justice in Palestine went to the event and demanded that he condemn the Holocaust that's occurring against the Palestinian people because he was a Jew. So because he's a Jew, that means that he must condemn, he's somehow responsible, and he must condemn what Israel is doing or supposedly doing. Now, obviously, this is anti-Semitic. Holding Jews abroad accountable for the actions of a government in a country they don't live in is classic anti-Semitism. But there's such a lack of understanding about this and anti-Semitism in general that the reason I have this video is because Students for Justice in Palestine posted it themselves. They don't even see a problem with it. That's the level of understanding that we're dealing with. And obviously after it was posted, a lot of people responded and were like, what is wrong with you? Like, this is disgusting behavior. But at the same time, you also had people on their side who were sharing this as, oh yeah, it's great, isn't it great that we're harassing a Holocaust survivor who has nothing to do with Israeli policy. And again, what we see is that from the online rhetoric, it translates to in-person activity, whether that be violence against Jews or graffiti, vandalism of synagogues. Now, spray painting Free Palestine on a synagogue, again, not criticism of Israel, especially synagogue abroad. This is nothing but pure anti-Semitism. And then on the top right, you see a still shot of one of the attacks which occurred in New York against a Jewish man in Times Square. There have been multiple incidents like this, as well as incidents in the UK with supposedly pro-Palestinian protesters driving around Jewish neighborhoods chanting about raping women. Again, we see the conflation with misogyny. And we also see a lot of targeting of activists, individual activists, and for the first time during the last operation, we saw that this was occurring with people who had nothing to do. They don't talk about the conflict. They weren't talking about Israel or Jews or anything. They just happened to be Jewish. And this is one example. There's a Holocaust survivor who is actually quite active on TikTok. She makes videos. And these are some of the comments that were left for her. This is just a small sampling. There were thousands. And then here's another example of the type of content that I received. Again, this is a screenshot of my phone of messages that I received. Just absolutely disgusting sexist language. And during the operation in May, we also saw that other activists who, there was like a makeup YouTuber who was targeted with, why aren't you condemning the genocide against Palestinian children? She doesn't make videos about politics. The only reason they were targeting her is because she was a Jew. So we see the same thing, an expansion basically because of social media of anti-Semitism. And previously it had mostly been activists, people who engage on social media and people who talk, prominent voices for Israel or supporting Israel online. It's not the case anymore. It has escalated, and it's escalated because social media networks have allowed it to escalate, and because they haven't dealt with it appropriately, because they haven't been serious about combating anti-Semitism. So today, what is the problem when it comes to misogyny and anti-Semitism online? And all of these apply to both forms of hate. So we have network bias, as I mentioned before. We have mainstream media, the way that they talk about women, the way that they deal with these issues, though it has improved, of course, it's still hugely problematic when it comes to how we view women, how we speak about women, how we respect women in the public sphere. Unfortunately, we also see the same thing with anti-Semitism. The way that people talk about Israel is used to lend legitimacy to anti-Semitic views because it's so biased. And this is one example. The BBC, they had a documentary about what was happening in Gaza with the Gaza border riots. And every time they said Yehud, which means Jews, they translated it to Israelis. So this is something very small, but it changes the way that people understand what's going on in the conflict and that there is an anti-Semitic element. And unfortunately there is, which is why we saw during these same marches that Palestinians in Gaza were flying a flag with a swastika on it. And just a week ago, there was a demonstration in the West Bank in which Palestinians were protesting a settlement, valid, fine, with a swastika inside a Star of David set on fire. Not fine, something completely different. And then again, we see that there is a problem of harassment, threats, and attempts to silence prominent Jewish voices, be they male or female, although more so with female, and also feminists, women who are active and speak out, women who are public figures, women who deal with any kind of controversial issue, receive harassment, threats, and silence, and are silenced. There was a study about members of parliament in the EU, and they said that 80% of them reported receiving threats of rape and or sexual violence in the past 2 years online, whereas male counterparts had like 4% or 2%. And one of them even spoke out in the interview and said, like, you go into politics because you want to make things better, but if every day you're receiving this type of rhetoric, like, what's the point? It feels like we're not actually moving forward. So this is a huge problem because it discourages women from engaging and from being vocal. And this is a minority, or at least in many industries, a minority that's underrepresented in many fields, especially in politics. So it's a huge problem social media networks need to consider in how they deal with their algorithms and how they form the social media platforms themselves. And that brings me to the third point, which is the technical structure. So the way that social media platforms are set up, they actually reward bullying. They reward harassment and bullying because the more you engage with content, the more that content is seen. The more people who like a post, the more prominently it's displayed, which means that there are more eyeballs on it. If there's something that is misogynistic and a bunch of people think that it's funny and it gets 10,000 shares, then it's going to get 10,000 more because Facebook in their algorithm automatically will display it to more people. That's one of the problems that we're dealing with, and what they need to change in how they deal with different forms of hatred. But in particular, from what I've seen in all of my research, there's 3 forms of hatred that are the most prevalent on social media: anti-gay, anti-women, and anti-Semitism. Those are the 3 forms that by far the hate comments are greater than any other form of racism. Not anti-Black, not anti-Muslim. Of course those exist, and of course it's a problem. But anytime you see anything that's pro-feminism or pro-LGBT or pro-Israel or Jewish community, you're invariably going to see hate in response. And as I mentioned, one of the biggest impacts of this is that you have women who don't want to engage, women who are scared, because who wants to receive 10,000 messages, threatening to rape you or to kill you? It's a big problem. And, I dealt with it myself, and I'm an activist, and I'm more like, I guess I have a stronger stomach for this form of hatred. And it's very clear to me what they're doing. Even for me, it's exhausting. It's exhausting to get these type of comments day in and day out. But at the same time, what they want is for women to be silenced, or Jews. And as I mentioned, 80% of EU politicians, they received sexist and misogynistic attacks online. This was in the last few years from the survey. And you see the same thing when it comes to Israel. I do lectures and I do trainings on social media with teens, and I'm teaching them how to engage on social media. And one of the questions that I've gotten just since Israel's operation is like, well, is it safe? Should I really be engaged? What's the point of doing it if people are just going to harass me? And it's really disheartening, because nobody should be made to feel like that just because they have a different view, and it's not just that. It's gotten to the point where it's not just that they're targeted for supporting Israel or for calling out anti-Semitism, but sometimes Jews are even attacked online for not criticizing Israel. This is something new that we hadn't seen before. If you're a Jewish person and you're prominent online in any field, then people are like, well, why haven't you condemned Israel? What? That it doesn't even make sense. And again, this has happened because we haven't dealt with it. We being the community, but also the social media networks primarily. We haven't dealt with it seriously. And this is a problem because it results in the silencing of activists and a reluctance for young people and for women to engage in fields that they would ordinarily engage in. And it's funny because the UN, obviously there's a lot of issues with the UN, a lot of hypocrisy, but this is an ad campaign that they ran about how Google searches have inherent bias against women. And they did research in different countries of what shows up in search women shouldn't. And invariably across cultures, it was misogynistic. Women shouldn't work, women shouldn't vote, women shouldn't whatever. And this is a problem that Google, for example, needs to deal with and find a different way to not promote misogynistic content. I didn't mention it before, but I'm sorry.
Apologies, someone unmuted.
Oh, okay.
Please keep going. Sorry about that.
The social media platforms, I mentioned how the algorithm works, that the more you engage, the more it's displayed. But in addition to that, a lot of platforms from Spotify to Netflix to Facebook, when you engage with content, they give you more content like that. The recommendations for the content are based on what your preferences are. So if you have someone who's inclined to anti-Semitic views or who holds some anti-Semitic views, Facebook will display more of them. This is a huge problem that all networks are aware of, and they have varying degrees of tactics of dealing with it and pushing back, but it's something that must be dealt with, because the status quo is completely unacceptable. And not just for misogyny and for anti-Semitism, but for all forms of hatred as well. So what can be done as us, as communities, as individuals? And there's really three things that I like to tell people to do, and that is educate, expose, and engage. And I will go over a little bit of what that means and how we can do it. You don't need to be a video creator or a huge activist in order to be effective online or just to have an impact. You don't have to do a lot, but you should do something. There are different forms of engagement and different forms of education. So obviously, when it comes to education, you can be a content creator. You can be someone who makes videos, someone who writes blogs, someone who is a graphic designer. This is a great way of engaging on social media and educating people about what the issues are when it comes to what is or isn't misogyny and what is or isn't anti-Semitism, and how can you know and how can you respond. But if you don't have those skills, or you're not interested, or you just don't have time, which most people don't, you can also comment. You can also share other people's content that you find engaging, that you find powerful. And you can also interact or even just like articles and content from other people as well. And the reason this is important is because of what I said earlier with the algorithms. Even leaving a comment, you see something that's just a bit off base and is a little bit sexist. It is better on social media to leave a comment than to just ignore it, which maybe runs counter to what we would think when we see someone who has bigoted views. Just ignore it, let it go. It's not how it works on social media because of the algorithms. The more that you engage, or let's say you don't want to write something at all. You see something that's off base and you don't want to engage, but you see that other people have left comments calling them out on it. Like all of those comments, because the more those comments are liked, the more that they'll display, and the more people that see it, the more people that interact. So this is one tactic of engaging and also educating at the same time. There is a bit of overlap with these three steps. Another way for engagement is to report. Obviously, when you see content that is just completely unacceptable, you can report it to the networks, and some of it won't be removed and some of it will. If it's something that's really beyond the pale, not something that's, something just completely disgusting, and the social media networks don't remove it, which usually you won't know for a day or two, screenshot it. Screenshot them refusing to remove the anti-Semitic or the misogynistic comment, and post the screenshot of that content itself. This is one of the things that I've done that's brought really, really good results when it comes to getting content removed. Facebook a lot of times has refused to remove content that was outrageous. So I screenshotted it and I shared it on Twitter and I tagged Facebook, and within, an hour, it was mysteriously removed after all. So they do pay attention to this kind of thing. They do pay attention to public criticism. And if you can get 5 other people to retweet or tweet the same thing with you, you will have more of an impact, because social media is a numbers game, which unfortunately works against us, but we can also fight back in the same way. When I wrote here, be smart about engaging, you don't need to engage in every single piece of content that you see that's anti-Semitic, or every single comment that's, misogynistic. But when you see an article from the New York Times that is, really unacceptable, then that is better to engage with than an account that's calling for the third intifada. If there's a group, an intifada page, and they share something against Israel and say, we want to kill all the Jews, you're not going to convince anyone who follows that page that that's wrong. But if you see something that's anti-Semitic on the New York Times and you leave a comment there, you might, because you don't know who is seeing that. In fact, most of the people seeing it don't care about Israel. So your audience isn't always who you're talking to, it's who might see it on social media. And that's another reason that it's super important to engage. And then, like I mentioned, upvoting comments on the websites on news websites and also on social media, liking all the comments that are presenting a correct view or that are calling out bigotry on a certain post. All of these things are really, really important, as well as sharing and uplifting voices who are speaking out about these important issues if you aren't a content creator yourself. The last thing I want to mention is that I said that students a lot of times are scared because they're scared of the pushback or of getting doxxed or threatened online. And the reality is that is a threat today. But there are things you can do to secure your identity online, even at the most basic level. So first of all, if being engaged online is something that you're passionate about and you don't want your face out there, you can also create an account that doesn't have your face, that doesn't have information about you specifically, so that you can engage with that type of content. Especially on Twitter, it's very easy to do. A bit more difficult now with Facebook, but definitely still possible. And that's one thing that I do in order to monitor and track what's going on in anti-Israel groups and how they speak about what the issues are today. I wouldn't use my own profile because I'm too known. So I have another profile that I use for that type of content. And then, of course, engaging and setting up 2-factor authentication. So all platforms today, from your email to your bank to social media platforms have two-factor authentication. And basically that means that within the settings of your account, you can enable two-factor authentication so that every time you log in from a new device or location, it requires you to receive a code to your email or your phone that you enter in order to log into your account. Now, what this means is that anytime someone tries to hack into your account, even if they are successful, they won't be able to get access to your account because they will also need your phone. Now, if your phone also gets stolen, well, then you're really screwed. But otherwise, it's a major obstacle for hackers to be able to take over other people's accounts, and just something that really unrelated to activism, you should make a habit of enabling that setting. Now, there's different levels that we can fight back against misogyny online. At the network level, as I mentioned, and also anti-Semitism, adopting IRA or adopting a more efficient definition of misogyny is going to help them identify what content is acceptable and what content isn't. They also need to adjust their algorithms in order to not reward hate speech, which is a big problem that they have right now. And then also they need to punish violators. So people who repeatedly post anti-Semitic content, whose content is repeatedly removed for this type of behavior, they remain on the platforms. That's something that can't happen. They need to have a new approach to how to deal with different forms of hate speech. At the individual level, we can report posts, we can expose, as I mentioned, screenshot when they fail to remove this and tag the networks across different platforms. And of course, we can engage and create with other people's content or create our own. At the government level, we can lobby different legislators. We can talk to our elected officials about what the issues with this are in Australia or in the United States or in Israel. It's an issue that affects all of these countries because it's the internet. So it's definitely something that's worth seeing what can be done at the government level. Obviously, they're aware of this. I know that Israel is, or at least was, part of an interparliamentary task force on anti-Semitism that was specific to online anti-Semitism. And that had representatives from the UK, Canada, United States, Australia, and South Africa, I believe, who were speaking about how, as legislators, they can deal with social media platforms and hold them accountable, which is really something that only the government in these countries can do. And as organizations, as I said, it's a numbers game on social media, getting together large groups of people who will engage with content, who will like other people's content when they put out something that's effective, who will just like a post. All of that is important. In addition to that, when there's an issue or a campaign that's coming up, it's important to get out voices who are writers to respond on behalf of the Jewish community, on behalf of women, about what is wrong with how people are talking about X issue that's happening right now. And one of the obstacles is that a lot of people feel hopeless, like, does it really matter because there's so much hate speech online and there's so much pushback. And as I mentioned a little bit, it's important because if we don't show up for the fight, then it moves even further to the extreme. People need to see that there is another side. People need to see that there is pushback and that there will be accountability when they say horrible, misogynistic things, when they threaten sexual assault or rape. They need to see that there are consequences for their actions. Now, maybe those consequences are just being banned from social media, but that's something. So this is part of the reason that we need to show up, and we need to engage, we need to speak about it, we need to call it out, and we need to work at the government, at the network, at the organization, and at the individual level to fight back. And these are a few examples of successes or partial successes of what has happened when the Jewish community has pushed back. So Hamas has many different media networks, and Facebook removed one of the major ones that had millions of views only in 2021. So this is a success that we've been pushing for a very long time. As I showed earlier, the Hitler was right tweet, BBC ultimately fired this journalist. And then more recently, when UNRWA was exposed for having teachers and staff who are consistently promoting anti-Semitism on social media, UNRWA has launched a probe into it. Why? Because it was exposed over and over again online, and it started to get media attention, and they faced increased pressure from this social media content. So it does make a difference. You do have the ability to affect change. It's just important to engage wisely. Like I said, prioritize what content you want to work with. Your audience isn't who you're speaking to, but who the other eyeballs that are looking at it are. and also engaging often. And when you correct information or correct statements, use facts, back it up, provide a couple of links. Best case scenario would be to provide links from a source that's more right-wing and a source that's more left-wing. You won't always have that, but nonetheless, that should be something to strive for. And also think about, as an activist, if you want to be on offense or defense, if you want to be someone who is putting forward more content creation of your own voice, or if you want to be more behind the scenes, reporting and engaging with content, maybe even from an account that isn't your own name, that would be more defensive measures. Both of them are critically important. Both of them are lacking, and we need to do much more of them. But just consider how you want to approach it and from which angle. So that is all I have in terms of the presentation, but I'm really happy to take any questions or comments that you have from here about the issues of misogyny and anti-Semitism and how they relate when it comes to social media.
Thank you very much, Emily. Before we take any questions, I'm going to actually hand over to Janet.
Thank you, Emily. That was very hard in many ways to take. It's very upsetting, all the incidents and all the facts, but you also give us the impetus that we want to do something, and definitely we all need to be engaged. Yes. So I thought we were having breakout groups so that we can all come up with a question for you. So are we still going to do that, or just take?
No, we're going to do that, yeah.
Okay, so we're going to go into breakout groups, and if we can all think of a specific question to ask Emily, perhaps the question might be, if we are living in this world of hatred, what can we do? And you have answered that, but there are so many people that's the next level. Is this going to be part of our work at National Council? So let's go into breakout groups and come up with a question to ask Emily.
So you'll be whisked away. It will probably be a different group than before, and you will have about 7 or 8 minutes to come up with your question. Just give me 1 second.
This will give everyone a chance to debrief a bit. Fantastic, Emily, thank you so much. And there are going to be lots of questions for you coming up any minute, but we're going to give people a chance to sort them out so we don't have 100 questions. There are a few in the chat as well, we need to make sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so having had a discussion amongst yourselves, I think we all found it, as always, could have gone longer. Is there anybody that would like to start off, or would you like me to start off with my group?
I'm happy to start off with our group because it comes from a slightly different direction, Janet.
Good, thanks.
Our group were thinking of many of the older generation who aren't specifically engaged with social media, but are engaged with mainstream media. Emily, do you have any tips for them?
So when it comes to engaging with mainstream media, just like anything with PR, the most effective thing is going to be your personal relationships with the people. So it's going to be your personal relationships with journalists or with people who are senior in the press that you're talking about specifically. So that's number one. Number two is that when you see examples of how things are reported that's problematic, be it for women or for the Jewish community, it's really important to screenshot that and to expose it to those connections that you have. Otherwise, a lot of times people just don't understand. And I think that when it comes to women and the media, a lot of times people don't even think. People don't even realize that it's a problem, how they're framing the narrative of how we speak about women. And then also with Israel, I do think it's a bit more biased, like it's a bit more of a concerted bias when it comes to what Israel is doing. And it's a step further sometimes when it comes to how that manifests in anti-Semitism. But both are examples of, you know, something that's important to bring up with the connections that you have. When it comes to exposing media through social media, it's another great way. Great. I can't tell you how many times BBC or Reuters or AFP have changed something about how they speak about Israel or how they report an incident in Israel because of the pushback on Twitter or on social media. Now, on Twitter in particular, you have the ability to tag the individual journalists or to tag the channels of the news sources themselves. So this is another great tactic that you can use to engage. I said in my breakout group, but I will say now that I have, for some reason, I have a problem with my battery. And I'm at 3%. So I might actually drop out right before 2:30. If I do, I apologize in advance. I'm not sure why it's not charging because it's actually plugged in, but it is at 3%. So I'll answer as much as I can before I get cut off, and I apologize in advance. Someone asked also, if you take a screenshot, do you suggest to paste the screenshot back under your own profile? Yes, like post it as a photo, share it as a photo, whether on Facebook or on other platforms, and then in the description explain why and what it is, and etc.
Okay, so our next question from Eva Light. Eva, you need to unmute yourself.
Unmute.
Yes, thanks.
Okay. Yes, my group is happy for me to ask this question that I've got. I'm similar to the case you mentioned, and that is that I only look at Facebook every couple of months. I don't look at any of the other platforms at all, Twitter and the others. And so I've hardly experienced any of this hate speech or misogyny that you talk about. And I'm wondering what I can do to help, even though I don't really want to engage with and waste my time looking at a lot of social media. I read a lot and I'm aware of the current affairs, but I don't look much at those things. Sometimes in an article I read, Twitter is quoted. So I probably know a bit about it, but I don't actually go to those platforms. So what do you suggest, Emily, that how can I contribute?
Sure. So if you're not really someone who's active on social media, I would say that what little you are engaged, if you even have a Facebook page, for example, follow other watchdog groups. This is a question that came up in my breakout session here as well. Identify organizations that you work with or that you follow in general, and follow them on social media, because they will share a lot of the content rather than you having to go search for it in places you don't really want to be. So that is an easy way. And also look out in other Jewish organizations and other Jewish groups for places that will share only, direct links to content that's pro-Israel that they want support from, for example, or they want a positive comment. So there's a lot of groups that are using this now in their email newsletters or in, WhatsApp groups, if you use that. So there's different ways to receive content from different groups or organizations that you engage with. And I would say that for people who don't want to spend a lot of time on social media, that's the
thing called C71. Yeah,
I'm sorry.
I'm getting newsletters from, is it called C71 or something? Anyway, and also the ADC, I support that and I read a lot of their emails.
Yeah, they have
the Anti-Defamation League Commission. Yeah, so I'm up to date with all that. Yeah, and I support. Yeah, okay.
Okay,
I'll let other people have a go.
I just quickly want to comment, because our group talked about, okay, so if it's harder for the individual, how can National Council partner with other larger Jewish organisations such as the Executive Council of Australian Jews and other peak bodies to put a policy together, perhaps, to fight online hatred and misogyny. Would that be the way? Would that be a good way, a good strategy?
Perhaps I need to answer this question, Janet.
Okay.
National Council is working with the Executive Council of Australian Jewry and other groups. If anyone would like to be actively involved in fighting anti-Semitism online and they don't know how to do it, we have there's a digital advocacy group. If you contact me, I'll put you onto the list of people, and they send out information about places where you can do simple things on social media. But you have to be committed to do it. We don't want to put people on the list and have hundreds of people who are non-active there. But there is a list, and you're very welcome to join that list to get something. I was going to talk about it afterwards.
Yes, I think the point of our group was, if you didn't want to get online, could the large communal peak bodies come together and put together a policy that represents the Jewish community to fight online hate? That was the question.
I think that's one aspect. I mean, obviously, you guys can discuss amongst yourself on what would be most effective in your communities, but it is definitely one factor that needs to be done. Just activists alone isn't going to be enough, just organizations isn't going to be enough. So some people, that's going to be their, contribution and role, and some people want to be more on their own, and activists and content creators. So it's definitely a piece of the puzzle, and it's very important. I do think it's something that should be done.
Yeah, okay. Anyone else would like to?
Yes, I would. Okay, I was with Sonia Gold, I believe, and the third person just never showed themselves or said anything. But Sonia brought up a very good point, and my major at university was family life education, and Sonia has been president of some anti-Semitism group that we've had before, and we discussed basically being brought up in the family and the talk in the family. By the time kids get online, how old are they? They're teenagers usually, because parents won't let them on before. And at that point, there's all these things already formed in their minds. Now, how do you get to educate these parents that are more or less poisoning? That's what we need to really identify with and dig into and work out how you could do that.
So I do think that there's something to be said for that. However, when it comes to online content, a lot of the younger generation are being educated or miseducated, should we say, from the type of content.
No, I think that they're still educated in their homes to begin with. And maybe those that are neglected, which is the point Sonia was making, busy parents working and not getting that education are the ones that succumb to the online media transitions.
Okay, so I think that there is something to be said for that. I can't really speak to.
No, you can't. We're older. We're both grandparents. You're not going to get there. Okay, we've seen it and we know it, and I've studied it, and she's experienced it. You have to start with the kids and the parents, young parents, maybe parenthood classes, maybe stressing things like morals and values and non-discrimination and togetherness and harmony and love and peace. It's the only way.
Unfortunately, we've actually lost Emily. She did warn us that her computer may drop out.
Yeah.
I think that maybe, Karen, unfortunately, you don't get to thank the speaker, which is a shame. You would have heard Karen's beautiful voice and lovely words. So what there is to say is this is an issue that is obviously dear to everybody's heart. You wouldn't be here tonight. And if you came to the AGM, it's been a very long evening and you would have dropped out by now, unless this was something that you consider to be important. So Emily's given you lots of ideas of ways that you can participate in dealing with the problem. There are more ways. As I said, one is to contact me and I can put you in touch and become involved in a digital advocacy group, but that's for people who are using social media. The other thing is, if you want to get involved more and you think the National Council should get more involved in the anti-Semitism side or in the misogyny side, contact me. Let's form a group of people who want to see if they've got other strategies that you think you might want to bring in.
What about major parental groups?
Well, all of these things are possible. Everything is possible. And the thing about National Council is we're a national group. We can do almost anything at a national level if people want to come together and do it. And,
And will you come out of Judaism to do it?
That's right. That's right.
Okay.
So be in contact with me if you are interested in doing something more, and I'll put people together and see where we go to from there. The other thing I need to say now is that before we go is that on the 5th of September, which is not very far away, just a couple of days before Rosh Hashanah, we are having a Rosh Hashanah women's gathering. That's a Sunday evening. It's going to be a fantastic evening. And for those people who, like me, who are in lockdown and who might not be able to have family and whatever around for Rosh Hashanah, this is going to be an opportunity to engage intellectually and spiritually in the subject of Rosh Hashanah. The following week, we're going to have something for Yom Kippur. So keep an eye out for that. And then even hopefully we'll do something for Sukkot as well. Lots of things happening up on NCJWA's agenda. Of course, there's also things going on in National Council in your own state or section. So please keep an eye out for it. If you do not know about it, the easiest way is all you need to do is write President at National Council of NCJWA. President will get to me. And so you don't have to remember very much in terms of an address. So the 5th of September, the Rosh Hashanah Women's Gathering. And thank you all very much for your attendance this evening. I think you might get a form to fill in at the end if we're lucky, and please fill it in if you'd like to and give us any feedback. Thank you all very much for your attendance tonight. And good night. And here is my little dog who will say good night to you.
Oh, my sweetheart.
Bye, Shirley.
Thank you, Melinda.
Thank you, everyone.